Final session is how to research effectively. Okay? And by effective research, I mean going a little bit further than Wikipedia. Okay. When you come to research a topic, often there are different ways of researching depending on what the topic is, as I've just illustrated in the lecture there. Sometimes you might want to research the obvious example of the policy that you're trying to uphold. So Erasmus is a good example of that. You go and look specifically at the Erasmus webpage, look at their stated aims and objectives, and determine for yourself whether they actually fulfill those aims and objectives. That informs a lot of your arguments. But very generally speaking, you've got 4, possibly 5 major resources that you can use for both prepared and impromptu debates. So what are they?
Sierra.
Let's call that MSN. What do I mean by MSN?
Mass media.
Mainstream media. So that's anything from print journalism, television journalism, and by print journalism I can mean daily newspapers, I mean weekly publications like The Economist, Newsweek, Time. If you speak any other language, read them in another language if you can. Okay? Because different perspectives are often created by the way we're brought up. So the language we speak, the society we grow up in, informs the way we view external affairs. If you read the French publications like Libération, Le Monde, you get a very different view of international affairs than if you only read Time and Newsweek, which come from the US perspective. So mainstream media, but as much variety as possible. And don't shy away from reading or accessing what you think to be biased information. Okay? As long as you correct for that by seeking biased information from both sides, you're okay. Yes?
Would you say that you hold in the language reading like an English newspaper, an American newspaper, or an Australian newspaper?
Absolutely. And read English translations of foreign newspapers. Okay? It's often interesting what you can discover in terms of the way international affairs are reported. If you read, for example, the New York Post, and read how it reports affairs in the Middle East, and contrast that with Haaretz, which is the Tel Aviv daily newspaper, which do you think is more pro-Israeli? New York Post. New York Post is Zionist to the nth degree, because that's the market it's written for. It's written for rich Americans who believe in the Zionist cause and will brook no criticism of Israeli policy. Little interesting fact on that. One country on the Security Council has used the veto more than all the other countries combined. Who is it? USA. And they've only ever used their veto for one purpose. Israel? To prevent Security Council criticism of Israel. Okay? So whenever you hear in a debate that we need to reform the Security Council because China and Russia are obstructionist and don't allow policy to pass, just remind people of who the real bloc on the security. We probably do need to reform the Security Council, but not just because of China and Russia. It's also an anachronism that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are only there because they were the Allied powers in World War II. Okay? That's what defines them. Britain, France, America, China, and Russia. Now people forget about China because the seat of China was originally held not by Chairman Mao in Beijing, but by General Chiang Kai-shek in Taipei, Chinese Taiwan. Okay? So mainstream media have a variety, different languages if possible. If you can speak German or if you're studying German, Die Welt and Die Zeit are probably good sources. Bildzeitung, less so. Okay? Anything that you would classify as tabloid journalism, like dismiss. Don't read The Sun, don't read The Mirror, don't read The New York Post. You'll get more intelligent comment from a 3-year-old eating a crayon. Okay? If you're reading in French, stick to the broadsheet publications like Le Figaro, Le Monde. But you also look at satirical publications like Charlie Hebdo, Le Canard enchaîné, or something like that. In England, you might want to look at Private Eye, which often tells you the news that mainstream media won't. It's accessible, it's available online. Biased information is good information. Okay? One of the reasons I don't like The Economist is because it pretends to be entirely balanced, but has a clear bias towards one particular position, which is liberalisation of economies. To that end, you can probably predict what The Economist is going to say on any given issue. If an economy is being liberalised, The Economist will support it, no matter what the actual consequences, because it feeds The Economist's philosophy. If economies are being restricted, The Economist will say this is always bad, even in cases where protectionism might be necessary for a certain industry in a certain country. Biased information is good because it's not just information, it often contains argument. Okay? But make sure you contrast it. Don't just watch Fox News. If you're going to watch Fox News, watch something to correct for that bias, like MSNBC. Again, both of them readily available online. If you want real information that comes from an interesting perspective and a genuinely internationalist perspective, probably the best source of mainstream media is Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera English. There is a qualitative and quantitative difference between Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic channels. Okay? Al Jazeera and Arabic is explicitly pro-Syrian, pro-Jordan, Jordanian, pro-Egyptian in terms of Middle Eastern affairs. Al Jazeera English gives you much more balanced and much more nuanced commentary and analysis. But the key here is it's not just information, it's commentary and analysis that you're looking for. Okay? So what else apart from mainstream media can we use?
Or some statistics or something.
But where are you going to find those statistics? Yeah, you can use offices, national or international offices that collect data.
I think a lot of climate change data on the UN, I've got the address on that, so it's impossible to find.
Yeah, offices that collect and publish data. Very often they will be linked to large international organisations like the UN or divisions of the UN. One of the first questions I asked the teams who debated the slow food or the local food debate was, what does the EU have to say about local food movements? What does the World Health Organization have to say about local food movements? What does Greenpeace say? What does Friends of the Earth say? These are the people who immediately spring to mind when I think about local food. Because I'm automatically thinking about reduced chemicals, reduced food miles. So I'm looking for environmental agencies to give me that information.
There's a green, about the local food thing, I think there was some, I'm not sure how it was linked, but there's got a bit of GM debate going on.
Yep.
But there was, don't just look at Greenpeace, because Greenpeace's stance is no GM, but GM is actually what we need to further the world.
Right.
So if you Google it, there's this fantastic speech by an ex-anti-GM, and now he's pro-GM.
Yep. GM doesn't necessarily mean bad food. We associate it with bad food because of the illegitimate actions of firms like Monsanto. Okay? The problem with most GM food is the existence of what they call the terminator gene. That means food is unable to seed. So poor countries have to go back to the seed supplier every year to buy new seed for their crop. Get rid of the terminator gene, and genetically modified means we can produce food which survives in inhospitable environments, drought environments and things like that.
And there's lots of developing countries, their poorer people maybe eat rice. Rice has vitamin C deficiency, but they've created GM rice called golden rice that
Yep,
contains
with vitamin C.
which could solve all the world's problems.
Well, not all of them.
But the GM, because people are so anti-GM, they're not, it's called a biohazard and they're not selling it.
Yep. And it could, in fact, be a very, very good thing. It'd be one of the best ways we have of preventing scurvy in large rural populations, and in China, for example, where fresh fruit is a problem. Because it's very often rotten by the time it gets to them, or it's covered in chemicals that never get washed off. So don't be swayed by labels that we think are bad or good. What was that line from Hamlet? There is nothing bad or good in this world, but our thinking it makes it so.
Yeah.
That's it. I can't remember the exact quotation, but something like that. So you have officers that collect and publish statistical data. Now those people aren't going to give you commentary, but they are going to give you statistics for you to interpret. And very often that data is necessary as a framework, as a skeleton on which to hang your argument. Where else can we look?
Does that include like NPOs like Amnesty International?
Yeah, absolutely.
But they do give commentary after their...
So they're slightly different. So we can look at NGOs, NPOs, activist groups. Okay? That will often come with an agenda. So we need to be aware of what the specific agenda is. And the easiest way to do that is to question, why am I being given this information? Why is this the statistic that they're choosing to report? Okay, you have things like Human Rights Watch. There's a fascinating website you can go to, it's part of the Amnesty website, where you put in your Facebook details and it researches your timeline, and then it tells you in how many countries you would be imprisoned, tortured, or even sentenced to death just for the things you've posted on Facebook. Things that you as a free citizen are allowed to do. It's an incredibly powerful tool to demonstrate the lack of rights provision around the world. 73 countries would either torture me or kill me based on my legitimate social activities. 73 countries. Because I'm politically active, I believe in attending demonstrations. That's principally the one that gets me tortured. Okay? My campaigning against things like female genital mutilation is usually the one that gets me killed. But I urge you all to do it. It's quite a sobering experience. So yes, we have NGOs, NPOs, activist groups. We have things like Greenpeace.
What was the website?
Hmm?
What was the website?
It's part of the Amnesty website. There's a link to it, and it says, test your criminality, or something like that. I will find out later today what the link is, and we'll publish it. Okay? So you can all have it. Where else can we look for information or argument? What other resources do you have here in this academy?
Coach.
Yes, your coaches, your teachers, your trainers, me. Ask us. We know things. You might be surprised how much we know sometimes. Wonderful quotation from the great American humorist Mark Twain. When I was 18, my father knew nothing. By the time I was 20, I was amazed how much he had learned in 2 years. It's not until you ask us that you can find out just how much we do know. Okay? So don't be afraid of approaching us. If your questions are genuine rather than silly, we're not going to dismiss them or you. Don't come up to us and say, how do I win this debate? Okay? That's a dumb question. First of all, if I could answer that, I'd have written a book about it, called Winning Every Debate. Secondly, if I did write that book, debate as an activity would cease to exist. Because everybody would know how to win every debate, and then there'd be no point. Okay?
If both sides know, then it's debate.
Yeah, but one side always knows
Wins
more.
the bet.
Is it a valid source when using coaches and trainers? It's a secondary source, and this is subjectivity of the...
But you don't know what our specialisms are, right? We could give you the source for our information.
So we therefore have to prove that our coach is a specialist in that area.
Not necessarily. Some of us have advanced degrees in particular subjects. When I give you information, I don't say this is true because I say it's true. I say this is true because it's backed up by all this evidence. And that's the evidence you quote. You don't stand up in the debate and go, and we know this is true because Rhydian said so in the last debate. That only works when I'm your judge. No, never works, okay? It's like me saying, I know this is true because my mate Dave in the pub told me it was. And my mate Dave's brilliant. He's not, okay? What I need is objective material. But as a teacher, my job is to provide those sources. To tell you, this isn't just my opinion, this is empirical data that we've collected from several scientific studies. For example, in psychology, about how people process psychological information. Did you know that if you make up a source, making up more details about the source makes it more believable? Yeah. More detail makes people think things are more true. If somebody says to me, what's your source for that, and I haven't got one, I look at them and go, oh, come on, you must have read the report produced by the McKinley Institute 2 years ago. There is a McKinley Institute. They produce reports on almost everything. Chances are they've produced a report on that one. That only works if you're very good at poker. Because what you're essentially doing is calling their bluff. I was in a debate once in Ireland. It was one of the first tournaments that offered a large cash prize. We were competing in the final for €2,000.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was a debate about how we treat prisoners in jails. Now, I'm a criminal barrister, so I know quite a lot about the prisoners in jails. None of my clients, obviously, because all mine are innocent.
No.
Well, innocent until proven bankrupt, anyway. But the person I was arguing against, a woman some of you might know called Saika Islam, who works for the English-speaking Union, very, very good debater, has a master's in criminology. She's not a barrister, but she probably knows more about the statistics to do with prison behaviour than I do. And it was a debate about what sort of leisure activities and materials we should give to prisoners. And one of the debates in Europe is whether prisoners should have access to what we consider adult material, pornography and things like that. And Saika stood up and she said, this debate is simple. All studies in criminology have shown, and she gave the name of an academic study in criminology, and she said this proved that when we give pornography to prisoners in jail, incidences of violence decrease by 17%. Most importantly, incidences of sexual violence, of rape within prison, decrease by almost 40%. It's a no-brainer, ladies and gentlemen. Give them that material, they don't take out their stresses and frustrations on other inmates. She was in opening government, that was her starting speech. The opposition had no idea how to contend with that. I was the last speaker on opposition. My partner didn't know what to do with it. And I tried to give him a response to it. He was like, no, that's not going to work. I won't believe it. They won't believe it. So I stood up and I said, Saika is absolutely right when she tells you that when we give pornography to prisoners, it decreases rates of violence by 17% and sexual violence by 40%. What Saika didn't tell you, and I've also read that study, is that this is only true for certain types of pornography. Specifically, what we call vanilla pornography. That is the most gentle pornography we can find. They want to give them all types of pornography. And the bit of the study that Saika deliberately omitted was that when we give prisoners, for example, pornography that deals with BDSM, bondage, domination, sadism and masochism, we find incidences of sexual violence go up, not down. And if Saika thinks I'm lying about this, she can offer me a point of information now. Saika stayed in her seat, and we won the debate. And as I collected my €2,000, the judge came up to me and went, she was so unlucky that you'd read that report. And I said, what report? And he went, what? I haven't read the report. And I'm betting this €2,000 that Saika hasn't either. I thought it was just a little too convenient. It was a piece of evidence that was too perfect for that debate. So my guess was, she's calling my bluff. And she's holding a pair of twos and claiming she's got 4 kings. So what do? I claim I've got 4 aces. And she folded. She didn't stand. Had she stood to offer me a point of information, I was dead. But my guess was that she was making it up just as much as I was. I suggest you don't do that. Because nobody's as good at poker as I am, first and foremost. Secondly, your judges might know a little bit more than you do. I was also relying on the fact that my judges didn't know that either of us was lying. And I was right. But your judges might. Okay, so don't do things like that. But you can use your coaches, teachers and trainers to help you, for example, discover a principle. If you are using them for source material, make sure they are giving you citations, not just giving you their opinion as a teacher. Alright? If they do give you an opinion, but you know that your debate coach from your school is also a history teacher, generalise it. Most history teachers agree that. Okay? From our sample, almost 100% of history teachers are that. There are ways of presenting the information that suggest that it is more authoritative than it is. But certain sources have more authority. Okay, so that's the next question we need to consider. From where do sources derive authority? We know that the appeal to authority is itself a logical fallacy. It's one of the ones you covered in exercises. However, and this is the bit where I give you knowledge that not everybody gets, the appeal to authority works. It works. Okay? There's a reason why people fly me around the world to teach things I've never taught before. And it's not because they like the sound of my voice. It's not because they like the shininess of my head. It is because I can put Oxford after my name. And that in itself is an appeal to authority. But a study done by Oxford University probably counts for more than a study done by Cambridge. No, I shouldn't say that. Bristol University, let's say, which internationally has a lower academic reputation in almost all fields. However, in some fields, Bristol by far outweighs Oxford. So certain universities like Yale, Harvard particularly, Oxford particularly, Cambridge, Stanford, generally produce research that is very, very good. That is what they are known for. That is why they are regularly ranked in the top 5 or 6 universities in the world. Doesn't mean they're right about everything, but it means we can have more faith in statistical reports that come from them than we can, for example, from think tanks which have a political agenda. Okay, so the Centre for Policy Research sounds very politically neutral. It's not. It is dominated by free market right-wing orthodoxy. So all their reports feed that idea. They're doing what we did in the last lecture. They have their principle, free market is good, and so all their arguments feed that. Academics don't. Academics work much like scientists. We infer from the data. We don't make the data fit our original supposition. Okay? So, although the appeal to authority is a logical fallacy, that doesn't mean it doesn't work. Okay? It's a logical fallacy if you use the appeal to authority to replace your argumentation. But if your argument is supported by an authority, that's an entirely different matter. And in fact, you should look to support your argument with some kind of authority. Other authorities you've got, apart from technocratic institutions, like academic institutions, you've got philosophical authority. Okay? Broad philosophies hold sway across culture. Generally speaking, Southeast Asian culture is dominated by a Confucian concept of society. Confucius, that great Chinese philosopher, one of my favourite statements of Chinese philosophy is, a man with one clock knows the time. A man with 2 clocks is never sure. That wasn't Confucius, because obviously they didn't have clocks in 3000 BC. But Confucius informs a lot of what it means to be a good citizen in a Chinese or a Japanese or a Korean construct. That is why we often see policies from governments in those areas that we would consider unjust, because they deny rights of the individual. For a lot of Chinese people, that isn't a denial of rights. It's simply a different construct of primacy of rights. And in a Confucian state, the rights of the community are more important than the rights of the individual always. Because the best state for Confucius was one that was harmonious and stable. There is an ancient Chinese curse, which is, may you live in interesting times. Because interesting times are times of flux, they are times of uncertainty, they are times of instability, and that usually brings harms. So for a Chinese person, the most important thing is harmony and stability. You achieve harmony and stability across a society of 1 billion or 1.3 billion people by having a government that is very controlling. You don't allow a lot of individual freedoms. Because if you have 1.3 billion people exercising individual freedom, you don't have a lot of harmony. You have a lot of discord and friction within that society. So when I talk to my Chinese students about democracy, I make sure that I talk to them about this is Western democracy. There is such a thing as Chinese democracy.
Yeah.
It's not just a terrible album by Guns N' Roses, okay? Chinese democracy does exist. And for the Chinese, for them, it's a better conception of democracy because it promotes a more harmonious and stable society. A lot of Chinese people are quite happy with the way the government operates. Some people recognise that there is still some way to go, particularly in provision of human rights, for example. But it's certainly by no means universal that everybody in China hates the government. Some of them can't understand why we are so critical of their government, when what their government has in fact achieved since the Maoist Revolution in 1946 is largely stability within their state, which hadn't been seen for hundreds of years in the Chinese state, since the first creation of the Han dynasty. So that's something we need to consider. Authority can be philosophical, it can be institutional, and it can also be logical. And what I mean by that is, through logical thought process, we can arrive at an answer that is more right. Okay? By following the logic. Logical thought is usually a requirement of intelligent argument. And the leaps of logic you make should be as small as possible in order for the argument to work. Following the principle of Occam's razor. William of Ockham was a 13th century monk in Britain who derived the idea that when making arguments of a theological nature, the leaps of logic in between the steps should be as small as possible in order to bring as many people with you as you want. So logical authority. We know this to be true because if X then Y and if Y then Z. That is always the case. Every time we've done it in history, that has been the pattern. Last night, in the demo debate, there was an issue over whether, if Snowden was returned to the US, he would actually get a fair and open trial or not. We said, on opposition, that it was highly unlikely that he would, given the experience of Bradley Manning, who didn't run, and that's the only precedent we have to go on in the modern era. Philip said we were saying automatically that he wouldn't, and we were saying that he was innocent. We never said that. That was a false contention. But ultimately, the authority we were relying on there was precedent. They had no precedent they could point to where a whistleblower had willingly returned to the US and been treated fairly and properly. We at least had one case on our side. And it was a case that mirrored the position of Snowden quite closely. Somebody working for the security forces who felt what was being done was wrong, leaked that information. Manning said, I'm prepared to take the consequences and stand in open court. and the government didn't want to let him do that. Reasonable, therefore, for us to suppose that it's more likely to follow that model than a completely different one, when that model had been successful for what the government wanted. So precedent is an authority. It's always an authority in a legal sense. That's how we argue in common law jurisdictions. We argue on the basis of precedent. Now, most of you don't come from what we call common law jurisdictions. Most of you have a written code, similar to the Napoleonic Code. It's what they call a civil code jurisdiction, where you have a bill which accords you rights. And anything that is not in that bill is forbidden. I come from a slightly different conception where everything that is not expressly forbidden is permitted. Okay? So I have freedoms that are taken away by government, you have rights which are given to you by government. That's essentially a philosophical difference between the Napoleonic and the Anglo-Saxon construct of society. Some jurisdictions other than Britain are common law. America, for example, where you plead precedent as authority. But following precedent isn't always going to happen. There is no logical imperative that just because we did something before, we will do it again. Okay? We are free to change our minds if necessary. That's one thing that Philip actually argued very, very well. Just because precedent fell on our side didn't guarantee that Snowden would be treated in the same way as Bradley Manning, because the fact that Manning was treated in that way and it created international scrutiny may well change the position of the US government. Okay? One thing I think we should all do, though, for Snowden, this is totally separate to this lecture, I think this would be really funny and it would bugger up the US completely. All go to your local airport when you get home and stand in the arrivals hall with a card saying Snowden. And if we all do it on the same day, it will be brilliant. They'll have no idea where he is. Civil disobedience, it's good. Okay, so that's a little bit about authority. Okay, so you've found out, or you know where to go for information. You know how to make sure that that information has authority. What about if you're trying to research argument itself? You've got things like commentary and analysis sections of news websites and newspapers. They usually separate the story from the commentary and analysis quite well. Okay? It should be obvious to you what is news reporting, what is editorial. As intelligent, functioning, critical human beings, you should be able to determine that for yourselves. You shouldn't need us to point it out to you. But where else can you look for argument? Where else can you find a record of it? Where do you usually hear arguments being made?
Government debate?
Public debates, assembly debates. Most mature democracies keep records of debates that happen in the national assemblies. Okay? In Britain it's known as Hansard. And you can go on the website, hansard.gov.uk, which has a record of every parliamentary debate that's ever happened since 1623, the Act of Parliament. Because they were all written down and we are still in the process of archiving them online. But most of the major ones are there, such as why Parliament has supremacy over the Crown in England and things like that. National assemblies very often have to record and make public the content of their debates. This again was a point of contention in last night's debate. Proposition claimed that the US had broken none of its own laws and that these laws were passed openly and in Congress. That was a downright lie of the proposition. Unfortunately, we were able to deal with it. But it was an absolute lie. Because you can check the records of congressional debates in the US, and you can see that there was never any mention of them wiretapping the phones of foreign ministers of European states, for example. Did you know that today they discovered that the US had placed a bug inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London? Why might they have wanted to do that? That's where Julian Assange is. But foreign embassies are considered sacrosanct in terms of sovereignty. You do not violate the sovereignty of an embassy because it's like an attack on the nation itself. The embassy in London is not British territory, it is Ecuadorian. To put a bug there, rather than intercepting satellite surveillance and things like that, is generally considered an act of war. So the fact that the US is now acting like the rogue nations it condemns is somewhat worrying. But you can check the record of public debates, you can check the record of assemblies debates. Where else can you find argument? What sort of things do you argue about with your friends? Do you have discussions about political events or political ideas?
Yes.
Yeah. So you've got general discourse. Okay? Is there prevalent general discourse about the topic? If you're talking about equal marriage, most of the arguments that people were aware of came from general discourse rather than from media commentary. And if you listen to media commentary about equal marriage, most of it was horrible. The general discourse was much more informed, much more enlightened, and much more progressive. To the point that one of the most odious journalists in the US, Bill O'Reilly, a man who would happily burn the Constitution and then wrap himself in the flag, rather than the other way round, even said on Fox News, there are no good arguments left against this. The gays have won. Now, I don't advise you to use a phrase like the gays have won, it's slightly pejorative. However, his opinion was not derived from listening to the congressional debates, where again, most of the arguments were pretty objectionable, or from looking at commentary and analysis in mainstream media, which continued to refer to gay marriage rather than equal marriage. But the general discourse, the people responding in opinion polls, made it clear that if the Republican Party continued to resist equal marriage, they would simply find themselves, as with the abolition of slavery, on the wrong side of history. Sorry, not the abolition of slavery, because it was Republicans who abolished slavery. I mean the civil rights movement. They would find themselves on the wrong side of history. That is a phrase that became current in the general discourse in America. It became a hashtag on Twitter. Okay? Wrong side of history was something that was appended to quotations from various senators about how this would lead to people marrying their horse for a tax break and things like that. There was a person in the House of Lords who claimed that having equal marriage would allow him to marry his son. Yes, because that's what straight people do all the time. We all go off and marry our daughters. And nobody bats an eyelid. I mean, it's just a bit weird, right, to assume that if you grant marriage rights to a group of people, you're also granting incest rights. That's just bizarre. But I've just given you a clue as to where you might find argument in general discourse.
There's a funny publication, which is a radio show, which is a bit like called The Now Show.
And the news quiz. You've got satirical programs on television, right? Which often provide commentary and analysis. Satire is a very, very good weapon. All good humour should stem from a position of anger. And it should always aim up and not down. Your target should always be above you in the social strata, not below you, so that you're not accused of bullying. But here you could look at things like social media trends. Okay? And social media trends work both ways. They can be positive, they can be negative. Online activism. There is now a campaign against online activism. Has anybody seen it? Quite powerful. Horrible images from war-torn countries with lots of thumbs doing this. And then the tagline, liking is not helping. Clicking like on Facebook does nothing to change the reality for people in Syria, in Homs and Damascus. Like this status if you're against war. Well, whoopee shit. Well done you. Have a cookie. You clicked like. Well, that's your job done as an activist then, isn't it? Abdicate the rest of your bloody responsibility to humanity because you've right-clicked on a mouse. I mean, honestly, some people. But you can look at social media trends. They are becoming more important because more focus is being paid to them by the powers that be. But at the same time, don't overestimate their value. Don't make the mistake that the West did about the Arab Spring and call it the Twitter and Facebook revolution. It's not. Not when 2%, maybe 1% of Egypt has regular daily access to the internet, and of them only a fraction have a Twitter account or a Facebook account to begin with. Mass popular movements are not defined by Twitter and Facebook. And because we use Twitter and Facebook, we shouldn't assume that everybody else who chooses to communicate does. Okay? Simple numbers on the street, numbers in Tahrir Square, have far more impact than the number of people tweeting about the people in Tahrir Square. Organisations, I'm going to go back to this, organisations, NGOs, activist groups, look at places like the Centre for Nonviolent Resistance to see what they say about political dissent. Based in Belgrade, wonderful organisation. Trained people from Tahrir Square in how to achieve critical mass on the street. Took the lessons of the Orange Revolution of Ukraine and started to apply them in the Arab world very, very successfully. Okay, argument needs to come with evidence, which needs to come with authority. No one individual aspect of your research is going to win the debate for you. The moment you hit enter on Google and a page pops up and you think, oh, well, that's that debate settled, that's the killer argument, you've probably misunderstood it. If that killer argument exists and is so easy to find, question whether we would have set that motion in the first place. We don't set motions that are easily won by one side or the other, because that's just not fair. So if you think you found a killer argument, question why that might not be the case. The last bit of research is the counterintuitive. Counterintuitive arguments are often better. What do I mean by better? I mean more effective, more persuasive, more memorable. Persuasion happens in memory. When people go away and think about what you've said, and their ability to communicate your ideas is contained in their memory. How memorable you make your statements. The counterintuitive stays with us because it's surprising. Okay? Freakonomics is a book full of counterintuition. Why do drug dealers live with their mothers is the question. When we all assume that drug dealers, drive fast cars and wear flashy watches and things like that. It's because most drug dealing gangs, it's only one person at the top who's actually making any money and everybody else is trapped in a paradigm of poverty. But things like Freakonomic arguments work very, very well because they run prevailing to the dominant position. So we have an idea that financial incentives are good. They make people respond. Lizzie.
And there's also a book which is called Quirkology, which is not really, it's a bit of than Freakonomics, but there's something like there's an experiment where they gave loads of people a gorilla, a child, and an economic forecaster and a tarot card reader shares in businesses and said, pick some businesses who got this much money to spend on shares, and at the end, the person who made the most money, I know they didn't give it to Freakonomics, I think that was a bit fun, but the person who got the most growth out of their shares was the child. Yeah.
People who make random picks on the stock market often outperform the experts, which goes to show you just how accurate financial predictions usually are. Economic predictions are usually about as useful as tarot cards or reading the entrails of a sheep if you want to know what the future holds. Don't place too much stock in them, okay? Economists get it wrong all the time. There's only one difference between a microeconomist and a macroeconomist. A microeconomist is wrong about specific things, a macroeconomist is wrong in general. Okay? But look for the counterintuitive. The one example I always use from Freakonomics is the example of the Israeli babysitting service. There was an Israeli nursery which had a problem with parents picking up their children late. So they knew that the prevailing orthodoxy of thought was, if we fine the parents for turning up late, because they still have to look after the children if the parents didn't collect them, we will fine parents $5 for the first half an hour. And if they turn up after that, we'll fine them another $10. So if they turn up an hour late, they're paying $15, which is an expensive rate for a babysitting service. In Israel, when you're dealing with a group of kids in a crash, that's a lot of money. They thought this would stop people from coming late. More people picked up their children late after the fines were introduced. Why?
Because they feel free to do so.
Yeah. They were now paying for the service. They weren't causing a disruption. Before, when they were showing up late and not paying anything, they felt guilty and they made efforts to correct their behaviour. Once they were being fined, it legitimised their lateness. They were no longer late, they had paid for an hour of babysitting. It's counterintuitive. We assume that a financial disincentive will stop the bad behaviour. What it in fact does is it legitimises the behaviour because we're now paying for it. Correlate that with an argument about green taxes. Do green taxes work? Why not?
Because people have they are no more obliged to do so because they pay for the service.
Yeah, as long as you can afford to pollute, it's fine, is what green taxes say. They say, don't worry about the level of pollution you cause, just make sure you've got enough cash in your pocket. Does fining people for smoking a cigarette on an aeroplane work?
No.
Well, it works for most people because the fine is set quite high. Usually the fine for smoking on a European flight is between 500 and 1,000 euros. Now, I like a cigarette as much as the next man. I'm not going to spend 1,000 euros on a cigarette. If, however, I'm a multi-millionaire rock star, and I'm sitting in first class and I'm paying 10,000 euros for my ticket anyway, what's another 1,000 to light a cigarette? In fact, it might be an ostentatious demonstration of my wealth. Look at me, I can afford to break this rule. So in fact, there might be a perverse incentive for me to break the rule just so I can pay the fine. It's a counterintuitive argument, but it is often more compelling for that. Because it forces us to reconsider the logic which we possibly haven't considered before. Prevailing orthodoxy is usually lazy thought. It's assumptions without proof. And when we test those assumptions, very often we find they're wrong. Freakonomics is a great book if you haven't read it. And it has a sequel called Super Freakonomics. Which sounds like a 1970s disco hit. Super Freakonomics. But there are other books that relate to the same idea. One is called Risk by Dan Gardner. Dan Gardner is a behavioural economics based in Canada. He's one of the smartest men I've ever met and ever worked with. Look at Daniel Kahneman, possibly my favourite human being in the world. Daniel Kahneman has published a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Right? In it, he examines the way in which we analyse and process information and data. He worked with a wonderful human being called Amos Tversky for a long time at the University of Oregon. Daniel is now at the University of Princeton and is the principal behavioural psychologist in the world. He is an authority on the way we process and analyse, particularly statistics and data, and the way we dismiss it. I've just done some research of my own at Stanford. I was out in California for 2 months earlier this year working with a professor called Daniel Levitin, who is a brilliant neuropsychologist. Our data is starting to show some very, very worrying things. I can't point you to the publication of this data because we haven't finished our data analysis yet. However, you'll all have my contact details. When it is published, I'll let you know. At the moment, I will tell you what our first finding is. That when we present people with statistical information that conflicts with an ideological or dogmatic point of view, they do not process that data as data. We took a sample of people who had expressed a strong pro-life position. They were anti-abortion under any circumstance, either because of religious or ideological conviction, that this was an innocent life and should never be terminated. Now, I agree, in principle, that innocent people probably shouldn't be killed under any circumstances. I'm a bit wishy-washy liberal like that. But I'm also a practical human being. My purpose in any abortion policy is to reduce the number of abortions that have to happen. All the statistical evidence we have ever gathered shows that if you want fewer abortions, you do it with a legalised abortion model, not with backstreet abortions. If you want fewer deaths occurring from abortions, you do it with a legalised abortion model. This is not opinion, this is not political argument, this is fact. Every single data collection we have done has proven the same. Fewer abortions, fewer women dying. Ultimately, less harm on both levels under a legalised abortion model. When we showed that data to people who expressed a pro-life position on ideological or religious grounds, the neurons that were firing in their brain, that were processing that information, were not the neurons we expect to fire when people process statistical, factual information. They were the neurons that people use when they read fairy tales, myths, legends. As they were processing the information, their brain was telling them that the information was made up. When we asked them to repeat the statistical information the following day, they couldn't remember the numbers, because their brain had dumped it in the recycle bin in their brain. Different parts of our brain, or different combinations of parts of our brain, process information in different ways, affect our ability to remember that information and ultimately to be persuaded by it. I was pretty frightened when Professor Levitin contacted me only about a month ago, and I was in California in February, March and April. And only about a month ago did we start to see this result come out of our statistical analysis. That when we try to convince people that their ideological position is wrong, they assume we are making things up, and therefore dismiss the information the moment they receive it. What does that say for our ability to politically campaign on ideological positions? It says it might be entirely pointless. It might just be a waste of money. All we do by putting that statistical information out there is confirm the two polarised positions. The people who believe in that data, or in the position that the data support, have their position entrenched. The people on the other side, the ones we really need to convince, just assume we're lying for the sake of a political agenda. That's problematic for discourse as a whole, but ultimately, until Daniel Levitin and I decided that we would actually test this, nobody really knew what was happening. We're starting to get a clearer picture of what goes on in people's brains when we try and convince them politically of things, and whether it's ever worth spending millions of dollars on a presidential campaign. Hopefully, by the time of the next US presidential election, we'll have finished our data analysis. It's going to take a while. We spent 2 months collecting it. I expect us to spend about 2 years collating it and analysing it. But that's just a little snapshot of what we're starting to discover. You're the first students ever to learn that. But that might not be believed unless you get past the appeal to authority that I represent. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.